So the concept of sacrifice is not lost on us, and it's not lost on the world, who oftentimes understand this principle way better than believers, and it's our concept. An amazing little piece of narrative, and not unlike the rest of Scripture. The more you touch it, the more nuanced it becomes. When we come across Cain and Abel and the offering of sacrifice, the natural question, I suppose, is where did that come from? Sacrifice, that is. Where did sacrifice come from? I mean, the very notion of it, the idea of it, and what is it precisely? What, if any, purpose does it perform? I mean, prior to this, and this is the first book, prior to this, there's not a single mention of it. And what? It's written as though we're already meant to understand what it's about. We mentioned last week that an animal or animals would have had to have died in order for God to have clothed the newly fallen couple. And some might say that that was the first sacrifice. The animals given their lives to cover the shame of the disgraced pairing. Others could argue that the first sacrifice was made by God Himself in making the earth to begin with, in that He personally invested Himself in it, and with a view to what He would eventually pay. And there is certainly some validity to that, but I don't think it really works the same. It is a sacrifice, the giving of oneself and make it, but I don't think it typically speaks the way we normally speak about biblical sacrifice, unless you are really taking into consideration the cross itself and the foreknowledge of it. I suppose it could be argued that the first blatant description of sacrifice came from Adam, in that to receive the future blessing of companionship, of spouse, of woman, Adam sacrificed a rib. It cost him, and it cost him a rib, which is part of the nature of sacrifice. Yes, the offering of what we have now in order to secure something of greater value in the future. This is what makes the biblical story of Jesus and His sacrifice so powerful. Because of the question is, what is the greatest possible sacrifice one could make in order to produce the greatest amount of good? Nothing touches the story of the cross. Now, when it comes to Adam, the text reads as though Adam was put to sleep and the rib was taken without his say-so, without his agreement or consent. And maybe that's the case. Maybe the way it reads is the way it happened. Or maybe God did have a conversation with him about it that we are not privy to. Personally, I'd place my money on that. I don't particularly enjoy the concept of God walking up behind Adam and knocking him out. But, maybe so. But in any event, even if the rib was taken without Adam's approval or prior consent, nevertheless, the demonstration of sacrifice producing blessing, rib producing companionship, was made. And sacrifice in order to receive some future blessing, as you know, is still practiced today. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. In fact, psychologists tell us that one of the greatest indications of success among people is their ability to delay gratification. If someone can delay a blessing in order to receive a greater blessing, it's a good indicator that that person will be successful in this world. And that's certainly understandable. The more you sow, the more you'll reap. But sowing takes patience. And this is no stranger to us. It's commonly found, and most commonly found among those we would typically refer to as successful people, at least in the eyes of the world. Anyway, in choosing to go to college, children or young adults sacrifice 4 to 10 years of their lives and no shortage of effort in order to, or at least in the hope of, securing decades of future blessing. Farmers sacrifice some of the harvest in order to grow next year's crop. Parents often and always go without in order that their children are better blessed or better equipped for the world than they were. So the concept of sacrifice is not lost on us, and it's not lost on the world, who oftentimes understand this principle way better than believers, and it's our concept. Be wise as serpents. Jesus had to advise them. The parable of the shrewd manager speaks in this direction as well. Naivety is hardly a virtue. And if you've heard me speak for any amount of time, you'll have heard me bemoan the church's almost willful ignorance of the world that surrounds her, to the extent I'm often left asking, what world do they people live in? So one wonders whether or not sacrifice, at least as a concept or even practiced, existed prior to the fall, given the natural way it just arrives in chapter 4. Someone might say, but before the fall there was no sin, and therefore no need for sacrifice. But atonement for sin is not the only reason people sacrifice to God. And it isn't always blood. Cain proves that by offering his crops. Sometimes we sacrifice simply as a way of showing gratitude. We give, because lovers give. In any event, it's clear that even in a post-fall, now corrupt world, this idea of sacrifice is something that's not only natural, but seemingly recommended by God, if not commanded by Him. So then it appears from very early on, the biblical witness is testifying that the fallen world should operate and function within a lifestyle of sacrifice to and with their God. That is, to give oneself the best chance in life, at the best path in life. That will include sacrifice. But the significance of the fall meant that the cost to us rose dramatically. The new world wasn't going to just cost us a rib. Now the child would arrive with greater suffering and pain. Now the fruit from the ground would come from the sweat of our brow. And if verse 16 of chapter 3 is as obvious as it reads, there now will be a seemingly natural competition or contention between the genders. If someone were to ask in a fallen world if there is a natural contention now built in, and it appears that's what 3:16 says. So if someone says in a fallen world, how could spouses avoid such contention or catastrophe, or at least reduce the risk of catastrophe? What's the best advice you could give to a married couple? Well, if you can find a better piece of advice than they must sacrifice for one another, you let me know. So now in verse 3 of chapter 4, without pre-announcement or explanation, we have the introduction of man offering God sacrifice. And as previously hinted at, the questions are quite natural. Where did that come from? Was it something man introduced in order to apologize in a way for what has happened? Is it something that God himself introduced or commanded for whatever reasons? And why is it important enough to be the focus of an entire lesson tonight? Obviously, as you'll have read the text, you'll know that what I'm about to say is speculation. But I think you'll have read enough of the text to conclude that it's legitimate or reasonable speculation. Given that God provides Israel entire volumes of sacrificial instruction later on, I think it would be legitimate to assume that that's what's going on here with Cain and Abel. Very similar in regard to sacrifice, and that it probably came about after some kind of discourse with God. A kind of, I don't know, perhaps like Cain, we whined our little spoiled heads off and said, this curse is too great for us. How can we possibly survive? And perhaps God responded with something like, look, if you want to survive, if you want a path back in this newly fallen, newly cursed world, the greatest course of action you can take is still going to be walking in step with your God, even in a fallen state. You might have sullied and ruined it all, but it's still my world, and it will function how I say it should function. And so if you would like to live a blessed life in spite of the fall, here's what it looks like. Let me talk to you about sacrifice and the giving and receiving and what that does to relationship. And what it looks like in chapter 4, to me anyway, is that Abel got it. He understood it. And Cain not so much. So we have the first war breaking out, and wouldn't you know it, it's over religion. Abel brings to God the fat portions, which, as you know, are the best cuts of meat. And he also brings those fat portions from his yearlings, the best of the herd. So in effect, Abel is bringing the best of the best from the best of the best cuts from the best of the herd. Now, to a God who will one day offer to the world the best that he has, Abel's offering is naturally and obviously pleasing to him, to a God who will do similarly for man, when he sees it in his child, would naturally be pleased. Whereby Cain, it appears, was only really going to church because going to church is what they did. And it isn't that Cain's sacrifice was wrong. There's no condemnation of what he did. It just wasn't as good as Abel's. But it appears that he wanted the same amount of credit for doing less than his brother. And not in this world, because to everybody who has, more will be given, and to those who have not, even what they have will be taken. It's not going to work like that. And any of you with any sense of history know that when we've tried to socially engineer the world toward that, it has been disastrous. Absolutely, utterly disastrous, in the hundreds of millions of a body count. So then, because the world didn't function the way Cain wanted it to, it's clear that he expected the praise, and when it didn't come, his whole world began to unravel around him. He became downcast, the scripture said, which would be fallen head, shoulders down, depressed, upset, angry. So because his world didn't function as favorably as Abel's world, he kills his brother. And if 4 chapters in, one of the first stories we have in Scripture is man killing his brother, if that doesn't rock you to your core, you're not reading it right. And if you're trying to tell me that somehow we've got better since then, so not only is this what we're capable of, this is what we're capable of when we were closest to perfection. There are 2 ways to get to the top. We can work hard, we can use the intelligence, whatever amount or degree that we have, and we can sacrifice the present for the future. That's clearly evident even in our world, yes. Billionaires don't accidentally become billionaires. They don't fall into a swimming pool of money. There are years, perhaps decades of sacrifice and investment, typically sacrifice in schooling and learning, years of anxiety and stress and worry placed on their family, years of mortgaging and remortgaging their home, risking the future of their own welfare children. These are the common traits we find among billionaires. It's also why they're rare, because not everyone's up to making those sacrifices. Most people would rather have less and spend more time with their family. For example, but on the whole, and as the natural way of things, we can live like that, we can make those sacrifices, and we can reap rewards that come from hard work, working honestly, working with integrity, intelligently. Or we can just kill everybody around us. And history isn't void of those people either. Children of Cain. Cain obviously favored the latter. Work less, expect more, and if it doesn't work, destroy the competition. and somehow believe that you are owed the same as the guy who did more than you. But it is interesting that when Israel are given chapter upon chapter on sacrifice and relationship with God, the outworking of that and what it looks like has already been taught in narrative form in the 4th chapter of Genesis. I told you, miss Genesis, you miss everything. It's foundational to everything. If someone says, where will I learn about sacrifice? 99% of Christians would send someone to Numbers or Deuteronomy or Leviticus. Genesis 4. So then biblically, if we want the best chance at life, it comes with walking with God. And that includes sacrifice. But someone says, well, Abel offered the best of the best and he was murdered. That's hardly successful by anyone's standards. Or Job. But they're only partly true. They're only part of the story. The recommended best way forward in life is loving communion and sacrifice with our God. However, given our fallen state and the rebellion that we ceaselessly insist upon, it's no longer a watertight arrangement. It used to be. It is no longer. We can still do all things well and suffer and die because of it. So says the cross. And practically every prophet that lived. What sin did was it corrupted everything, even life with God. Prior to the fall, blessing naturally followed man's relationship with God. It was absolutely assured, paradise, unspoiled, a given. After the fall, we find that blessing was no longer an assurance from living righteously. Might be argued it's the best course of action. 9 times out of 10, it's the best bet, but it's not watertight. So says the cross. Now, it's still the best way to live. If you read the stats, Christians, compared to the rest of the world, our stats are through the roof in favor of good living. Our marriages last longer. Our children are healthier. There's less depression, less suicide. But it's not guaranteed. So what do we find here, particularly about God? Well, you wouldn't expect the early descriptions of man's relationship with God to be terribly nuanced, right? You would imagine if you're picking up the Bible, you would expect to find the ground rules that are being established, basic concepts would have to be grasped. Then it becomes nuanced. And so what happens in Genesis would be expected to be rather basic in its presentation. And that is what we find. It is very basic. Kinda. Genesis doesn't sound or look nuanced at the first glance. But it is. In fact, clinical psychologist outstanding. Jordan Peterson says the Cain and Abel story, this little thing that runs, 15 verses long? He said it's the most profound story he's ever read. And that man is well read. So Genesis is nuanced, but it's only nuanced after we read the rest of Scripture and then look back at Genesis. Then come look at that. Look at that. It was all there. It was all there. It looked basic. It looked elementary. And it's nothing of the sort. You got the most profound story ever told, according to one. But on the surface of it, it doesn't get much more basic than Abel being described in a favorable way because he loved God and because he acted righteously. God is pleased with Abel's offering, meaning life is being restored. Man living in communion with God is our part, our effort at anti-curse. It acknowledges our wrong and works to mend the rift. Happiness and the joy of relationship begins to be experienced between us. The bridge between Creator and the created is being built and strengthened and built from our side. And then there's Cain, who stands at the other end of the spectrum, ending life, bringing back the darkness, pro-curse, favoring death and destruction, suffering, mourning and grief, seeking to destroy relationship between man and God. In contrast to the opening words of Scripture, this is let there be dark. And the worst form of it, not even murder. It's a brother murdering his brother. It's a return to the darkness and a rejection of the light. It's an embracing of death and the rejection of life. And it appears that Cain has learned from his parents, in that when caught, remorse doesn't seem to be necessary. In fact, his arrogance is difficult to even comprehend here, in view of what he just did. How should I know where Abel is? Am I my brother's keeper? To which God thunderingly responds, here and elsewhere, no, you're not your brother's keeper. You're your brother's brother. And then in true human response, when God does what God needs to do, and the spanking is forced from him, and even so is still incredibly gracious toward Cain. For in other biblical texts, what Cain did would bring a sentence of execution. Nevertheless, in spite of the grace extended toward Cain, in that Cain gets to live, Cain still ends up whining like a teenage girl who's just had her phone taken away. To me, this is arguably the most distasteful, disgusting of all human traits, this sense of entitlement. The world owes me. Here he stands, the blood still crying out for the ground. What am I owed? It's too much for me to bear. Even when clearly in the wrong, he's still, this is too much. I'm owed better than this. I am a sinner. I have contributed and still contribute to the pollution of sin. And yet somehow I'm owed something. You owe me. In essence, Cain is standing broken-hearted that he gets to live. It hasn't dawned on him that he's the recipient of amazing grace here. Because it's not in him for it to dawn on him. And our society, as every generation before us, has hardly been spared from his offspring, entitled, spoiled little brats, who, when they don't get their way, death and destruction follows. This is Cain, and they are his offspring. And unsurprisingly, the last words we hear about Cain and his murderous, entitled little life is the ominously sounding, "Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord." Ha! Ain't that true? But we need to fact check that. Cain left the presence of the Lord long before he killed his brother. Let me say it again. Cain left the presence of the Lord long before he killed his brother. And the killing of his brother is all the evidence we need. So that was Abel, and that was Cain. But this is our God, desperate to bless, desirous for fellowship, willing to sacrifice and share in the fellowship of sacrifice, in the joy of giving and receiving. Even in a fallen world, anxious to show us the way to live that'll bring the better chances of success. And that is a life with him. But along with that, a father who unflinchingly disciplines his children when they venture into the intolerable and unacceptable. God has lines that he will not allow crossed. But no one can read this chapter and see the evil and then witness God's response and conclude that our God is anything less than immensely patient, kind, and gracious. If we're not seeing that, I don't think we're reading it correctly. Thoughts, comments, questions?